Hey everyone, just back with the second lecture video, of the semester on Chapter 2. This is Homework 2. We're going to start at home on our little journey around the world this semester with the North American realm. So obviously the North American realm is where we all live right now. Most of us are from here originally. Some of you may not be. You might have immigrated to the United States. But we're now in the North American realm, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Now, basically, the North American realm is going to be United States and Canada, the two countries that we have on the northern part of the continent. Now, North America as a continent is actually several countries. It's United States and Canada, but it's also Mexico and Guatemala and on down through Central America to Panama. So that's North America as a continent, but we're talking about the realm. And if you remember from your first lesson, the realm has to do with more than just the geographic boundaries of a continent. So we're going to talk about why we have this North American realm where we have it currently with just United States and Canada here in this realm. So these are your key terms that we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. I'm going to scroll through this because we have a lot to get to, and I want to try to make these in a reasonable amount of time. And again, if you don't have a lot of time, this is probably going to go hopefully a little bit under an hour. Just take a break, come back, watch it in several sections. You can break it up. You don't have to watch it all in one shot. But I'm just going to kind of highlight things. There's too much to look at to talk in detail about everything. But I'm going to go through this as efficiently as possible while supplementing what's in your textbook. I'm not just going to regurgitate what's in there. I'm going to add some context to some of this for you. So again, here are your primary concepts and ideas, and we're going to mention most of these. Those are, again, going back to the first lesson, you should know what all those are on that list, what all these mean, and you should pick most of this up in your reading assignment for your textbook. So, we'll start with the United States. Here on this map, and Canada as well. So the population clusters, when we look at North America, you see there's a lot more people in the United States than there are in Canada. That's one takeaway you get from this map. Remember, we're talking about maps. We can glean information from those maps. If you look at where the population is, you see it's really centered over here in general in the eastern part of the United States. The western part doesn't have as many as far as density goes. Remember what density is. That is a measurement of how many people there are per certain land area measurement. So people per acre or people per square mile. And you can see in the west you have some high population areas and spots, but you don't have that density like you have over here in the eastern part of the country. In Canada, you're going to notice that most of the people, so right here is basically where I'm pointing my cursor right now, is basically the boundary between the United States and Canada, more or less, just roughly. And you can see most of the people in Canada live pretty close to the border of the United States, within a couple hundred miles. So right here it says that, within 300 kilometers, 200 miles, that's where most of the people in Canada live. The overwhelming majority of people live there. So in terms of how we're growing, the United States is growing slightly faster than Canada, although that's slowed down in the last few years. Our population is not growing quite as rapidly as it once was, and really that is more of a function of immigration than anything else. Used to, back in the old days, you kind of had a birth rate and then you had a death rate, and if your birth rate was higher than your death rate, then that's how you'd gauge the population was growing. In today's world, immigration is a big factor in determining that overall population. And here in the United States, the birth and death rates, I'm not going to say it's flatlined, but it's kind of evening out from historical numbers. But the immigration numbers that come across our border, that dictates how fast we're growing. And currently we get a lot more people immigrating here than Canada receives. And we're going to talk about that a lot here in the next little bit. So both countries, Canada and the United States, have a very high degree of cultural diversity. That means we have a lot of different cultures that affect our current culture. So if you look back through history, and again, we talk about history and how it relates to geography, history and geography go hand in hand because we have to know how we got to where we are now. So when you look at the population makeup currently of the United States and Canada, you'll see that Canada has a lot of East and South Asians, which is East Asia, as we'll learn later, is going to be Japan, China, Korea, those countries. South Asia is going to be India. It's going to be, and Southeast Asia is going to be Malaysia, Vietnam, those kind of countries. So East and South Asia for Canada. The United States, we have a different mix of people. We have a lot more Hispanic people here in the United States. And as we probably all know, that comes from immigration to the United States because we are located closer to Hispanic countries, to Hispanic or Middle America. The next realm we're going to cover, we're going to learn about that culture. A lot of our immigrants come from there. We have a high African American population. Of course, that goes back to history. Not all, but a very high percentage of people that live in the United States that are African American, their ancestors were brought here as slaves back pre-Civil War. So again, that's where history and geography ties together. We have a high Asian minority here as well. Now that is, you can find Asians all over the country, obviously, especially in more urban areas, but the West Coast is really the highest density of Asian Americans here in the United States. And then we have numerous other ethnic backgrounds here as well. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the physiographic regions. So this, remember, we're talking about this as North America as a whole, or I'm sorry, the North American realm as a whole. However, we recognize most of these as being in the United States as well. So we have the far west, you're going to have the Pacific Mountains, which are denoted in this kind of orange color here. And then you're going to have the Rocky Mountains, which is this brownish color right here. And then the basins and plateaus in between those two mountain ranges. Now these are both very, very large mountain ranges. And I don't know why it really cuts it kind of off, come down through here. It lessens down through here, but the mountain chain continues on in Mexico. But then you have the Great Lakes is going to be in this area, of course. You've got the Appalachian Mountains in this orange color right here. You've got the Canadian Shield, which basically surrounds the Hudson Bay up here. And that's a location we're going to talk about here in just a little bit about the minerals and natural resources they have on the Canadian Shield. And then you have the interior lowlands in this area right here. So these are the primary. You also have the Gulf Atlantic Coastal Plain. Some that are mentioned on here, these are all. The Piedmont is somewhat attached to the Appalachian Highlands. It's just the foothills of the Appalachians. So most of you have probably visited other states in your lives, and you have experienced these areas. You might not have known which of these, what they were called at the time, but if you can look at a state, for instance, you can see that Iowa is in the interior lowlands, or Florida is in the Gulf Atlantic Coastal Plain. Anything on the southeast coast is in the Gulf Atlantic Coastal Plain. If you've been to California, to Los Angeles, you've been out here to the Pacific Mountains area. Now, I want to call your attention to this at the bottom. So this is the cross section of what we're looking at here. And this has average elevation on there as you grow across the state. So this denotes a higher elevation, and of course as you get over here, you get the lower elevations. So you can see the Rocky Mountains, which is here, And the Pacific Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, which are here, are pretty good sized mountain chains. In the middle, you have this interior basin and plateaus. This is still high in elevation, but it's not quite as tall as the mountain chains themselves. So you still have a higher type of climate, a higher type of terrain. However, it's not as high as the mountains. It differentiates itself just a little bit. And as you go across the Great Plains, you start to decrease in altitude, and then the lowlands you see are the lowest point, obviously, and then you have a little hump over here with the Appalachian Mountains, and then the Piedmonts are shown right here. So that's going to be important. Keep that in mind as we go through this lesson. We'll see that a couple of times, and I'm going to talk about something else in detail on that. Climate, we talked about this in the first chapter. You've got the primary climate zones, which is A, B, C, D, E, and H. And then you've got the subcategories underneath each one of those. The only place we have anything tropical in the United States is the very southern tip of Florida, and of course Hawaii, if you count that. But we're talking about just the continental United States for the time being. And then CF and DF are really good for commercial farming. And when you look here on the map, you can see a large portion of the Midwest, the Great Plains, the Southeast are in those climates. So that's why we have a lot of good farming in those areas. Continentality, that has to do with the idea that the oceans really affect the climates. So if you're closer to an ocean, you're going to be more affected from that ocean with regards to your climate than in the center of a continent like you would have in the Great Plains area. And in general, as you go north in the latitude, and this could be said in the southern hemisphere as well, but there's a lot more land areas you can see in the northern hemisphere. So this is more true because there's more population up here. The very low population south of the equator in the southern hemisphere. But typically, your populations are going to be found along the coast, and as you go interior to a continent, you're going to have less and less of a population. You see that in North America, you see that in Asia, and even some in Europe. You have a little bit less population as you go away from the oceans. Now, the rain shadow effect. Now, this is something that we're going to talk about a couple times throughout this class of the semester. Especially, we're going to talk about it over the next 3 chapters because it has a very important impact on precipitation and climate in both North America and South America. So 3 realms: North American realm, Middle America, and South America. So what the rain shadow effect is I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you this because it's easier to explain. So you have our weather comes in the United States, it comes from the west and flows to the east, right? So our weather systems come across the United States from the west before they get to us. Let's say this is California, the very coast of California, and you've got mountains right here. Now this one says the Rocky Mountains. That's not accurate because the Rocky Mountains are not on the coast. So we'll call these the Sierra Madres or the Sierra Nevadas. And as the winds blow rain into the mountains, you have uplifting, and as it uplifts, the air gets cooler. It gets a little it cools as it goes up over the mountains. Therefore, it drops its rain because the water condenses at cooler temperatures much more easily. So you drop all your rain on this side of the mountain, and as it descends, it warms up. The drier air actually warms quicker than moist air, and it loses out its precipitation on this side, which is called the leeward side of the mountains. And you don't have much moisture once you get on the other side. That's the rain shadow effect. So when you get over these mountains, you're going to have an area that's drier than the other side of the mountains. This is very evident in the Pacific Northwest. If you see a map of Washington and Oregon, you see rainforest, temperate rainforest on this side of the mountains. Over here, it's almost desert once it gets to the other side of those mountains. So That's what the rain shadow effect is, and we're going to talk about that as we go through the next couple, at least 2 or 3 realms. So, a little bit more about the physiography. So, the Great Lakes area. Most of you probably have learned the Great Lakes are located here. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York on this side, Ohio on the southern side. These are the Great Lakes, and of course on the north is Canada. Ontario predominantly, and then Quebec is over here. So all these lakes are interconnected, and they flow from west to east until they get to the St. Lawrence Seaway that flows kind of northeast into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the St. Lawrence Seaway. That river and that seaway at the bottom of it, it's about half and half. Half's the St. Lawrence River, half's the seaway as the salt water backs up in there. It flows into the Atlantic Ocean, and that's a very key area for Canada with regards to their culture. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit more in just a second. You also have the Missouri and Mississippi river systems. The Missouri is denoted here with the Mississippi just because it's so long. It runs all the way up to the Canadian border with the Rocky Mountains. So all of this area runs to the Mississippi and leaves next to New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico. So those are the 2 primary drainages in the United States. You have a lot more drainages, but those are the 2 biggest and primary drainages that we have in the United States. So now we're going to jump back to history and talk about the settlement of the United States and Canada and the Native Americans that lived here when the first settlers got here. So currently in the United States, there's less than 30 million Native Americans in the United States. So their lands, what they got from a lot of times the bogus treaties in history, they have about 4% of the national territory of the United States, which is a tiny percentage of when you consider how many Native Americans were here when the first settlers got here. In Canada, the Native Americans are called the First Nations. They have about 1 million of them in population up there. They have much, much larger tracts of land in Canada than they have here. The Canadian government has historically, not always, mind you, I'm not saying Canada has done a great job, but in recent decades, they have treated their First Nations members or Native Americans better than we have in the United States. So in the northern sectors of British Columbia and Quebec, they have a lot of land. Also, one of the territories is now pretty much Native American or Inuit. Excuse me. And the primary settlers or colonizers that we had in the North American realm were British and French. Now, we did have Spanish as well. Florida, California, the desert Southwest were all colonized by Spanish. And there's heavy Hispanic influence in those areas. However, most of the realm was Britain and France is who colonized. So you've heard of the American Dream. We hear that thrown around in politics all the time now. So it's kind of lost its luster as far as a positive term. But the American Dream traditionally was because our country had cultural values. And we wanted to pursue those cultural values for everyone, like education and other goals that made our citizens and our people better with regards to lifestyle and wealth. And when I say wealth, I don't mean just being rich. I mean wealth as far as we can afford a home, we can afford food, we can live comfortably in this country. A lot of people in the world consider that to be wealth. So, and I'll mention this several times throughout the semester. My wife's actually from Peru, so I have a very unique experience, and I've traveled a lot, and I understand how other people in the world look at us here in the United States. So the primary language of the North American realm is English. We also have a section of Canada that speaks French. About 25% of Canada speaks French. I would say a lot of them speak both, but some do exclusively speak French. And having a common language can be a good thing because it enhances our ability to travel within our realm and see different places and interact with people without having to understand or translate a different language. So there are some conveniences to having the one language that is predominant in the North American realm. Religious backgrounds also play a key role in how our culture is formed and how it operates. This map, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it kind of delineates where the different religions are predominant. One thing I don't like about this map is the Baptists and Catholics are pretty much the same color. You can barely disseminate the two. The Catholics are going to be more up here in the Northeast and in the Southwest and a little bit in Florida because of the Hispanic influence. Of course, the Baptists are going to be predominant in the Southeast of the United States. And this continues on with the religions. You can see that in your textbook on the map. And again, it is a cultural factor, and it's something that does contribute to the fabric of what our society is today. Now, with regards to how we separate our different political areas within our countries. So, both countries are considered to be federations. A lot of people think we're a democracy, which we are in essence, but we're a federal democracy, which means we have subdivisions within our democracy, within our country, and those are called states in the United States. In Canada, they're called provinces, and they have a few territories up here as well. So, as you should know by now, the United States has 50 states, Kentucky being one of those, of course. Canada has 10 provinces, and they have 3 territories up here. The territories more or less function just like their provinces do in this instance. With regards to our natural resources, this map is in your textbook. You can look at this. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail on this. What I am going to do is kind of summarize that you see a lot of mineral wealth comes from areas that have a lot of mountains. The Appalachians are actually, at one time, the Appalachians were a huge mountain chain, just like any of the other big mountain chains of the world. However, it's also one of the oldest mountain chains. And as you know, over time, gravity and the elements weather rock and land. And it's such an old mountain chain that it's been weathered down to a point. It's kind of small with regards to like the Rocky Mountains or even the Sierra Nevadas out here on the Pacific coast. It's a smaller mountain range now, but it's been weathered down. So you still have those elements, those natural resources in there that may be of some value. And you can see there's some oil deposits here. There's a lot of coal here. And in the Rockies, now here you see more of the dots, which that's going to be more of your mineral type resources. Your lead, your silver, your nickel, copper, gold. Those types of things are going to be found in your bigger, younger mountains because those are mineral deposits. Coal and oil, as you can see here, are spread out not necessarily in the mountains. And the reason for that is because those are formed in typically sedimentary layers of rock. And I know we haven't studied this, but sedimentary layers of rock is layers of rock that were deposited in different environments in a different layered type of rock strata. Think about the bottom of an ocean, the sand and the calcium that accumulates there. That's limestone. That's what we have here in Kentucky a lot. There's sandstones. Those are sedimentary rocks, and those contain the organisms that died at that time compacted, and that's what makes your oil and your coal and your natural gas. So that's why you see those spread out in non-mountainous areas as well. So those are this is the distribution of your mineral resources in the North American realm. So again, just what I just said, the western mountain ranges, you have some of your metals, your more mineral type resources. Our fossil fuels are going to be more in your sedimentary basins, and that's oil, coal, and natural gas. Appalachia has a large amount of coal reserves. Oil can be found in different places, especially in the Permian Basin down in Texas. That traditionally was a big oil field. It's getting a little less important now than it was traditionally. So now we look at where the urbanization, the economy kind of started blooming back in the old days. So you see here on this map, you see the old manufacturing belt, and you see all this area up here in the northeast. That's also called the Rust Belt today, because a lot of those old kind of industry types of manufacturing processes have gone away from up there. One reason is because the economy has changed in the United States since then. We don't do as much as that kind of production as we used to. Also, it got so polluted in those areas, they had to shift to other areas. They basically ruined the environment, and that's why some of these northeastern states have tougher environmental regulations than other parts of the country, is because the pollution was so bad in these areas that it really was a hindrance to those areas with regards to retaining people living there and stuff like that. So that's the old manufacturing belt. Now you see some circles on here. These are high-tech areas. California, Texas, down here in North Carolina you have one. That's your high-tech areas. So that's going to be a newer type of industry or development in our history. And then you see the major urban economic regions is going to be in your orange areas, and then secondary in your kind of yellowish area. And you see one here, Louisville and Nashville, both, Memphis. Those are your secondary urban economic areas. So basically a little bit smaller cities than these big orange areas that you'll see here. So these are going to be important. You'll see these again. You have your economy sectors. So I'm going to give you examples of these so it makes more sense to you. So the primary sector, it says extraction of raw materials. So that's going to be mining. That's going to be mining coal. That's going to be mining iron ore, gold, whatever raw material it is, bauxite for aluminum. That's the mining process. That's taking that material from the earth. So that's the primary sector. That logging could be in there, cutting trees for wood. That would be a primary. The secondary sector is going to be manufacturing these raw materials into finished products. So those are going to be factories. Those are going to be factories that make things from those minerals from the primary sector. So you've got, and again, I think examples are easier to remember. You've got mining, primary, factories are secondary. Tertiary is going to be kind of where we are today as an economy. Now, we still have all these things in the United States, so don't think just because we've gone to a tertiary economy doesn't mean we don't have any primary or secondary sectors anymore. We do. We still do those things. However, our country has moved more to a tertiary sector. Tertiary is services. Think about healthcare. Think about retail. Think about restaurants. Those things, technology, that take care of people and improve our living capacity and our make living easier for us, that's the tertiary sector. So those are your services provided. So those are the primary examples. I want to give you those examples because sometimes reading these, you think, well, that could be this. It's pretty straightforward once you learn these. Again, first one's going to be mining or logging. You're taking that resource from the earth. Secondary is going to be actually making stuff in factories from those resources. And then tertiary is going to be retail. You're selling them. You're selling food in a restaurant. Your healthcare. You're taking care of sick people. Those things. That's the thing. The way I remember them easiest, I guess. So now we're going to go on to railroads. We call this the realm of railroads, and that's a little bit deceiving. I don't know. I don't think I put a slide in here. This is the textbook PowerPoint. It's always kind of more difficult to teach from somebody else's PowerPoint, but I didn't have the time to redo a whole PowerPoint. So we are originally called the realm of railroads. And it makes sense because when this country was expanding west, we discovered railroads were one of the most effective ways to move goods from one place to another. And you can see, you think this looks like a good amount of railroad. And it is, and it serves its purpose. It's the cheapest way to move goods. It's cheaper than even putting trucks on the road. So it has its pluses. However, rail is also very important in the modern world for transportation of human beings. You've probably heard of high-speed rails in the last few years, especially in other countries like Japan and China and Europe has a lot of passenger rail. Almost none of this is passenger rail. This is all freight rail. And passenger rail serves a very important purpose because it keeps cars off the road. And that lessens the air pollution that we have that's contributing to climate change. So other countries have really nice passenger rail service. The high-speed ones, like in China and Japan, I mean, it's almost as fast as an airplane sometimes to get from one point to another. Whereas here in the United States, we have very little passenger rail. Everything we do here is based on driving in a car. So I wanted to delineate those two things because if you've heard in the news in recent years that the United States is way behind on passenger rail service, that's true. But shipping rail, we have a pretty good network set up to move goods from one place to another. So when we look at history in the United States, what we've seen is most of the people live in urban areas. The majority of people worldwide, and even here in the United States, live in urban areas. Now, in the old days, in history, you have a city, and you have most people live or work or interact in the center of that city. That's called the central business district you see down here at the bottom. That used to be the center of every city. But then, probably there's different dates on it, I've looked at this, in the middle of the 1900s, our population slowly started becoming suburban in nature, which means people didn't want to live in the middle of the city anymore, but they wanted to live on the edge of the city. So they started moving away from the center into what we call today suburbs. So when you get in the bigger cities, and I like to use Nashville as an example of this because most of us, I don't know how many students, I haven't looked at the roster as far as where you are taking this course from. If you're in South Central Kentucky here, where I'm close to Bowling Green, then you've probably been to Nashville a whole lot. You can also use this example for Louisville as well in Kentucky. But Nashville has the center of Nashville, the center of the city, which is basically what everybody thinks of 2nd Avenue down there on the river. Okay? So that's the central business district. So for a long time that was neglected because as people moved in the 1900s, moved to the suburbs, the center of the cities, this is urbanization, the center cities got kind of neglected. They got kind of run down and kind of impoverished. And the suburbs started to really build up. But the last probably 20 to 30 years, there's been efforts to revitalize the central business districts of cities, Nashville included. We all know today, anybody that's been to Nashville knows that's a big entertainment district now. A lot of bars and country music stuff and restaurants. So that's really been a success story. Some cities have done it better than others, but they're trying to revitalize that. We're still a suburban nation, really, with regards to population. Even though the centers of the cities are being upgraded and revitalized, it's still kind of more of a destination than really for people to live. So when I think of Nashville, and any of you that are familiar with Nashville, you think about what we call the suburbs. You've got Hendersonville, you've got Gallatin, you've got Murfreesboro, you've got Laverne, you've got all these different what we call suburbs. Now, back in the old days when Nashville was a smaller city, each of those was its own individual small town on the outskirts of Nashville. It was a different town. You would drive through farmland to get from Nashville to Hendersonville. Now, the city has filled in that gap and it's all the same city. So when we talk about cities in geography, we like to use the term MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area. So if we took say the actual population of Nashville, the city, I'm just making this up, I haven't looked recently, it might be only 300,000 people, the city of Nashville. But the Metropolitan Statistical Area, which includes the suburbs, might be 1.5 million. Again, I'm making those numbers up, don't quote me on those, but that incorporates all the suburbs as well. So just wanted to let you know how we differentiate the suburbs from the city. Deindustrialization was after the 1970s. We started losing manufacturing jobs. Some of that was due to automation. Some of that was due to outsourcing jobs to other countries because labor was cheaper in other countries. So some of it moved out of the United States. Some of it was automation. Some of it we were transitioning to a tertiary type economy. So here are some of the key terms. I'm going to kind of go through these kind of quick just because I'm taking a little bit too much time, more than I wanted to on here. So you can see these in your textbook. Gentrification is what I just mentioned, the revitalization of upgrading of downtown areas and neighborhoods. That's the term that we put on that to kind of spruce the downtown back up to its glory days and make it an attractive area to go. Silicon Valley, you've all heard of Silicon Valley in California with regards to IT. So, talking about what I just did, a polycentric urban region and suburban downtowns is what I was just referring to. Those suburbs have their own kind of center of town. So in Nashville, you have Nashville City, 2nd Avenue is the center of town, but Hendersonville's got its own little downtown. Gallatin's got its own little downtown. Murfreesboro got its own little downtown. So they're still different counties sometimes, and they have their own courthouses and county government, but it's still the same urban area. So we talk about inequality. You hear this on the news a lot. You hear it in politics a lot. We hear everything with regards to politics these days, and especially stuff that we talk about here in this course. So the United States has always had a lot of opportunity, but it's also always had a lot of inequality. It's more pronounced here in the United States than it is in Canada. And as we've transitioned our economy to a tertiary economy, what we've done is we've kind of taken the middle class down a little bit from what it used to be. So back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, back in those days, so a high school degree would get you a decent job. And people back then considered working at a factory a good job. You made decent money. You made enough money to buy a house and a car, and you could live comfortably on those types of salaries. As we've transitioned, probably through the 1990s till now, to a tertiary economy, what you have happening is the jobs of a tertiary economy require more education. And because of that, sometimes our less advantaged communities don't have the same opportunities that maybe they could have had back earlier. But earlier you had more problems, like racism, like inequality factors like that. So there's all kinds of different angles to look at how a country is performing and how the middle class can succeed or not succeed in the inequality in things based on time, culture, economy. All those factors play into that. So here's just one example. We take Georgia. And in Georgia, these two maps, again, remember what I told you in the first lesson. When you look at a map, look at the title first. It's going to tell you what you're looking at, what kind of data you're looking at. So we see here that this map over here of Georgia is on population growth between 2010 and 2017. Over here, this map is showing the poverty level in 2017. And what you see is And there's a circle around the Atlanta area, and they want you to look at that for a reason. So this is the suburbs of Atlanta, all those blue-colored or teal-colored counties here. And you can see the poverty level is low in those counties. You can also see the population growth is decent, high in some counties and moderate in other counties. So there's more people moving to these areas, and there's more jobs, and people are making more money in those areas. The population growth out in this area, you see, is slow. Nobody's living there. Or some of them are negative. They actually are losing people. You see here, there's a lot of people in the poverty in those areas, in those counties. So that's how we can draw correlations between different data sets on maps. Okay, what are we looking at here? We're thinking higher population growth looks like it goes to better jobs. So who's moving here? Are these people with college degrees? Without college degrees? What ethnicity are we talking? There's all kinds of things that we can look at with maps and start to draw some conclusions based on the data that we see here. So again, we're still talking about inequalities within cities, within metropolitan areas. Yeah, you probably all heard the term the wrong side of the tracks. That's basically what this is talking about here. Depending on what neighborhood you're in, has a lot to do with how successful you can be, that you have an opportunity to be. People that live in certain areas that we hear the term food islands or food deserts. That means there's a lack of produce or lack of stores in a certain area. These people might have to drive 30, 40 miles to go to their nearest grocery store. Those type of inequalities occur between different parts of cities. This map is kind of washed out. I really can't tell what it's even trying to... I don't see any boundaries on here, so it's obviously some city somewhere. But it depends on the neighborhood as far as what you have available to you. And that might mean a myriad of things. That might mean, like I just said, access to good food, good stores, shopping. It might mean access to education. What are the schools like in this neighborhood versus another neighborhood? So again, these data sets are things that geographers look at all the time. So immigration. We're going to start talking about immigration just a little bit. So a couple of things. One is we got more immigrants typically along the southern part of the United States. And that is predominantly because of our proximity to Latin America. Most of our migrants come from Latin America. So to Florida and even to New York, that's not in the southern United States, but they get a lot in New York from Puerto Rico. So when you visit to New York, you're going to get all kinds of different Latinos, but you're going to see a lot of Puerto Ricans. When you go to Miami, you're going to see all types of different Latinos from different countries, but you're going to see a lot of Cubans. When you go to Los Angeles or San Diego, a lot of Latinos, but a lot of Mexicans. So in our area, originally we had more Mexican immigrants in the United States. More recent years, because of political issues going on in Central America, they come up from Mexico, but they actually come from Central America. So you're talking Honduras, Nicaragua, those types of countries, El Salvador. They're coming through Mexico and coming into the southern United States. Now, this is a hot button topic in politics, and I don't want to try to influence anybody one way or another. But I'm going to give you some information, and this information is critical for our country, because one political side wants to make you think that immigration is terrible, that the immigrants coming across the border are awful. Now, we have laws, and we should follow the laws. I don't disagree with that at all. However, our government has put in place the capacity for our immigration services to fulfill the need of the number of immigrants that want to come to the United States. Therefore, we have an immigration problem of coming across the border illegally. So, we need immigrants. One reason is because our birth and death rate is kind of flatlined a little bit. It's not exactly the same, but it's not what it was historically. So, if we want to continue to grow as a country and our economy, we need immigrants to come here because our, how do I put it, our naturalized population is not reproducing enough to make the country continue to grow. So if you want to grow your economy, you need people. So we need immigrants. And what our government needs to do is fund our government agencies to be able to process immigrants and have these immigrants come here legally. That's the best solution. Not demean immigrants, not make it political. Just take care of your business and do this in a way that's productive for both sides, because we really need the immigrants. And I'm going to share a story with you right now that's kind of off topic, but I think it's important for people to hear different sides of this. So I mentioned before that my wife's from Peru, so I have a lot of Latino friends. I speak Spanish, so I'm very close with a lot of Latinos. Many of them are legal immigrants, some are not. So what I've learned going through this and having friends and knowing these people is, and I'm not going to inject my personal opinions on this as far as, what the politicians say. One thing I found, though, is many of these immigrants, the illegal immigrants, of course, they use fake IDs to get jobs and stuff here. And one thing that I've realized and I've studied and learned about since learning that is that when they get a job with these IDs, one thing that people don't understand is they pay in. They're forced, when you work, when you have a career, you're forced to pay into the Social Security and other taxes in your area and into the federal government. So there are millions and millions of dollars that go into Social Security that these people are making at their jobs that most naturalized Americans don't want to do a lot of the time. So they're paying into the Social Security system. That's millions of dollars. And because they're using fake IDs, they'll never claim that money when they get old. So they'll never use it. So they're actually keeping Social Security somewhat afloat right now because of their input and lack of output from that system. And that's just one example of how intricate it is. And again, I'm not trying to sway anybody's opinion or anything. I'm just pointing out something that, they don't tell you about on the news when some politicians whining and crying about something. They don't talk about these kind of things on the news. They just want your vote and they want to demonize people because of this or that. This is a very complex issue. I mentioned in my intro video, I'm an environmental scientist and I work with farmers a whole lot. And I can tell you firsthand that most of the farmers that I know and interact with use immigrants to work on their farms. I have heard of some states, some examples, when they crack down on immigration, some of their produce in the fields goes bad. They can't use it because they can't get it harvested because they don't have the workers to do it. So those are things that you have to think about. It's not just a knee-jerk, one side or the other type of argument. This is something that needs to be resolved in a productive manner. So that's my 2 cents on that. Just wanted to pass that along. It's not as simple as they want to make it sound like it is all the time. So again, we go back to our melting pot scenario. We've always had immigrants since this country was founded on immigrants. The people that first came here were escaping persecution in other places. They wanted to get out, and they came here and created the United States. We have more African Americans in the United States than they have in Kenya right now. Our Hispanic residents right now is nearly half the size of Mexico. I mean, we have a lot of immigrants. Miami is the second largest Cuban city after Havana, Cuba. Montreal, you can see here, largest French-speaking city after Paris. So we have a lot of immigrants in our entire realm. And the very fact that we are like that is a very good thing, because it makes us question things. It makes us strive to do better. People come here because they want to be better, and I think that's a positive thing in our culture. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this. This is in your textbook. You've got the 10 Canadian provinces, the 3 territories. You've got the Atlantic provinces out here. They're going to be your smaller ones. You've got Quebec here. Again, the St. Lawrence Seaway, that's the French-speaking area in there. You've got Ontario. Toronto is here. You get out here in the kind of the Great Plains area, the interior, you got Manitoba, Saskatchewan. Edmonton's kind of the mountainous one, and then you got British Columbia is also very mountainous in nature. So, I've already talked about that. Well, let's talk about the Arctic North. Let me go back. So you've got your territories up here. You've got the Yukon, which is next to Alaska. This is Alaska up here. You've got the Northwest Territories, and then you've got Nunavut. And that was recently created / renamed. I think it was 1999 is when that happened. And that's basically done, of course, for the indigenous people there, the First Nations. But there are First Nation territories extensive in all of these areas. Again, we mentioned this earlier, most of the population is right along the U.S. border. Of course, as if you go further north, it gets colder and colder. A lot of boreal forest up there. When you look at Canadian cities, they're typically associated with cities that are in the United States across the border. You've got Toronto to Buffalo. You've got Windsor to Detroit, Vancouver to Seattle. The capital of Canada is Ottawa. It's on the river down here, the Ottawa River, that's near the St. Lawrence Seaway. Again, here we see the French-speaking people, this 25%. And there was a push early for Quebec to gain its independence from Canada, because it's just like, you know, some people here in the United States want to secede, like Texas from the United States. They felt like they had a different culture, but that's kind of on the wane now. You don't see as much of that as you used to. They have 1.7 million native people, the First Nations. Basically, those are Inuit, which what we call traditionally Eskimos in the northern part up here in the Arctic, and then the more traditional Native Americans, the Métis. And it makes up 5% of the population of Canada. Here is some maps of where you're going to find different ethnic groups in the United States. Native American, you see it's heavily in Alaska and in the western United States. You see a little bit over here. That box you see in the middle, that's Oklahoma. So the reason you don't see any in the eastern part is more or less because they were all run out of the eastern part and sent to Oklahoma on reservations. So most of these in Oklahoma are traditionally from the eastern United States, and then all the Great Plains and western Native Americans are out here. Navajo and Cherokee are the largest two. Cherokee actually have 2 reservations. They are 2 bands. They still retain one in North Carolina. And there are Great Smoky Mountains over here. And then you have one that, as a result of the Trail of Tears back in the 1830s and 40s, they were sent to Oklahoma to a reservation out there. African Americans, again, here's a population map of where their greatest concentrations are. In cities, in all the rural areas across the southeast United States. And of course, race has always been a sensitive issue in the United States. It continues to be to this day, and you all see the news. You see examples of this all the time. Hispanics, you see out here a lot, of course, in Texas, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and California. And you see, of course, in Florida, like I said, it's going to be a lot of Cuban Hispanics over here. Northeast, you have probably more Puerto Rican. A mix is there as well. And then Asians. So you're going to have Asian Americans across the United States, especially in urban areas. But the highest concentrations are going to be on the West Coast. You see here in green. Of course, that's the closest proximity to Asia from the United States. So you're going to have higher immigration status out there than you have, but you have Asian Americans across the entire United States. Now we're going to talk about the regions of North America. Most of these are geared for the United States. You're going to recognize these. The northern frontier is the biggest, and it's in Canada and Alaska. That's basically boreal forest, and not a lot of people live there. You got French Canada, that's unique to Canada in the area that they speak French along the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then you got the North Atlantic coast, which encompasses a little bit of Canada and a little bit of the United States, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The Northeast, and of course they did this again, Southeast and Northeast are virtually the same color. But the black boundary there along the border of the northern border of Kentucky and West Virginia, that is the Northeast, which Ohio to basically New York and Massachusetts. Southeast is where we live currently in Kentucky, and over to West Virginia, down to Florida, over to Louisiana and Arkansas. The Southwest is Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, a little bit of Oklahoma, tiny bit of California. This line, I think probably Las Vegas should probably be in there a little bit as well, but they have that in the Rocky Mountains. I'm not sure that's really Rocky Mountain, but for the sake of the textbook, we'll leave it there. The Midwest is going to be your highest agriculture areas, the Great Plains. It's pretty flat out here in this area, and that's going to be your best climate for growing crops and raising livestock. Of course, we talked about the Rocky Mountains and the West Coast. So those are your regions of North America. And here's some facts on those regions. I'm not going to read through each of these because I'm already taking way too long in this lecture. And then we're going to go through each one and kind of discuss the characteristics of each. This is the North Atlantic coast. Remember, that's from Vermont, New Hampshire, up the coast into Canada. So there's no really big cities up there. Pretty rugged terrain, rural in nature. It has a maritime, i.e. the beach, the ocean. So you're going to have a big influence there. Not a lot of resources other than logging and trees. Not a lot of big industry up there. So you got French Canada. I'm going to let you read about that in your textbook. One interesting note, French-speaking Acadians in New Brunswick, that's a good term to know, Acadians. They're French-speaking, like it says here. And the reason that you have the Cajun culture down here in New Orleans and the coast of Louisiana is because they immigrated from Acadia down here in history. And they heavily influenced the culture in the New Orleans and southern Louisiana area. So that's where your Cajun culture comes from, is the Acadians. That's why the Cajun language or dialect is what it is. It's kind of a hybrid between French and English with a hint of Spanish in there every now and then. So that's where your Cajuns originally come from. A lot of hydroelectricity up there because that's all they really have is running water. And the southeast, you're getting into some good-sized cities as well. You've got Atlanta, you've got Miami. Charlotte area is really gaining steam, as is Nashville, as far as cultural areas. You've got the South was at the forefront of their human rights issues, your old racial segregation because of the African American population there. A lot of the cities down here are considered kind of newer, like Charlotte, Nashville, Memphis, even Miami, Jacksonville, than your traditional Northeast New York, Philadelphia, those type cities up there. Miami is considered a world city. Of course, you'll read that in your textbook. The Southwest, historically, it was kind of the Permian Basin down here in Texas has traditionally had a lot of oil. It still does. They're still pumping oil down there. It's not as important as it used to be. It's diversified a little bit more down there. You have some really technologically advanced areas and centers in like Dallas, Houston area. The West Coast, we're familiar with California, Portland, Seattle, up to Vancouver, British Columbia. Major economic regions up there. The Central Valley is a major farming region in California. Again, that's located between two mountain ranges, so they have a lot of irrigation. You've heard a lot recently about the drought out there, but now they're getting flooded out these last few weeks. So they're doing the polar opposite of what they have been getting. And again, we have a heavy Asian influence out on the West Coast. And the Rocky Mountains is the area between the two mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas and the Cascades in the north to the Rocky Mountains. Has Las Vegas again in the Rocky Mountains. For the purposes of our course, we'll leave it there. I personally wouldn't put in the Southwest, but it's a very fast-growing. It's one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States, just because of its climate. A lot of migrants go there because there's a lot of jobs being created, and it's relatively cheap to get a home there or acquire land and build a home. So the Midwest, that's going to be your farming area. Again, I've already mentioned that. Livestock, corn, soybeans, wheat, all that is produced in the Midwest. A lot of food processing, of course, because that's the source. You're going to have the food processing as well. But overall, they're losing people. There's not a lot of big cities out there other than probably Chicago is the biggest by far. And they're just using people to some of the more urban areas. And then this is the northern frontier that we mentioned earlier. A lot of natural resources up there on that Canadian Shield area, which remember is around the Hudson Bay. So I'm going to kind of skip through these just because of time purposes. Climate change, we're losing a lot of Arctic ice up there in the northern frontier, which is affecting things greatly. When we talk about climate change, they feel it about twice as much there in the polar regions as we do here. It's really accelerating there. Unseasonably hot and cold spells up there, so it's really, really changing things. Like here it says shipping routes might be opened up more in the future. They already have been really, but even more in the future. Canada takes care of their natural resources a little bit better than we do in the United States. They have agreements on all their federal land as far as limiting logging and mining and things like that. In the boreal forest up there, that's what dominates that northern frontier, and that's basically your pine type trees like spruce, fir, pine. A lot of wildlife up there. So that's it for this lecture. I kind of hurried through it at the end just because I'm taking a lot of time. And most of this is available in your textbook. As always, if you need anything, feel free to reach out. Several of you have had a little bit of issue here or there with access to some things, and I thank you for pointing those things out to me because they help me. Sometimes I don't know what's going on your side, what you see and what you're experiencing. So please, if there's anything you need, just reach out and let me know. Thank you very much.